Hey, welcome to my channel. I'm a late diagnosed autistic human being from France living in the UK, and I make videos about my own experience as a late diagnosed autistic person. And this video is my second attempt at filming my video on childhood autistic traits. I tried filming it once before and it actually turned into a video that I entitled "Watch me struggle to film a video while in autistic burnout" or something like that, because I literally did the whole introduction, reached the point of like actually getting into the video. By the way, sorry, I'm out of breath. I've been running around prepping everything to film. Anyway, I reached the point of actually starting to read the points on my list of traits, and I was like, it's too much. I don't have the energy for this, so I ended up rambling. But I have actually been feeling a little more energized these past few days. I went through a few weeks of being completely, having completely no energy. And I feel like it's starting to come back a little bit, just a little bit. I'm not back to my normal self, but I'm definitely still in burnout, but I have just a little bit more energy than I did last time I tried to record this video, so hopefully this time I can finish it. So I've made several videos on my channel where I talk about my autistic traits, but I haven't made one specifically about my childhood traits, and I feel like it can be helpful if you're a parent trying to figure out if maybe your kid might be autistic, or you're a kid and you're trying to figure out if you might be autistic. Especially kids nowadays have access to a lot more information online than my generation and the ones before me did, because I didn't grow up with social media or anything like that. So I just wanted to quickly mention I'm wearing a really cool t-shirt. What does it say? Ask me about my current hyperfixation, and there's a frog on it. It was actually a t-shirt that my partner bought me for when I got my autism diagnosis. As kind of like an autism, a diagnosis present. I had someone recently comment on one of my videos like that he was saying how to him getting an autism diagnosis is nothing, like it wouldn't be exciting or validating or anything like that. He would feel absolutely appalled to be told that there's something wrong with him. And I was like, you don't get it, okay? Like this diagnosis was one of the most exciting things in my life. But anyway, if you know, you know. If you don't, you don't. Okay, so let's just jump straight into it. So these are in no particular order. There are so many of them that I just keep. I have a note on my phone, and then for each video that I want to make, and like I write a list of all the points I want to talk about. And literally for this one, I've been adding stuff to that list every single day for the past week or two. So I'm like, when is it gonna end? But I told myself, like, because sometimes that can actually stop me from wanting to record a video, is if I feel like I don't have all the information. It's part of my rigid thinking. So what I tell myself in those cases is like, it's not exhaustive, and I always have the option to make a part 2, if I have enough more points that I want to mention that I didn't mention in that first video. So if I have any more things to add to this, I might make a part 2, but let's get into it. So those aren't all of my childhood autistic traits. They're the ones that I could think of. So yeah. So the first one is I loved watching flames whenever my dad would make a fire in the fireplace, or I liked striking matches and like watching them burn. I was really fascinated with it. Was almost like hypnotic, I would get into a bit of a trance watching the flames. I don't know, it was something really mesmerizing about it. And I also liked staring at my bedside clock. So I had an electronic clock. I'll put a picture of the kind of clock that it was, but and I would spend hours. I could spend hours staring at it and finding patterns in the numbers. And pattern, if in case you don't know, pattern recognition is a big element of autism, and I definitely did that. And it would give me a lot of satisfaction. For example, I would read dates into the time. So for example, whenever it was for example 1943, I would think, oh, that's my dad's birthday because he was born in 1943. Things like that. Or if it was 2222, I would be like, ooh, very excited. So that's the first point. The second point is I had a different experience of hunger. So what I mean by that is, and I've talked about most of these things in different videos, but I have very poor interoception and always have. And as a kid, I couldn't understand what people meant when they said that they were hungry, especially in the first part of the day. I really struggled to eat breakfast or even lunch, and I wouldn't feel hungry until past 5 in the afternoon, and then I would come home and devour my tea and dinner. That was my main meal of the day, and the rest of the time I didn't feel hunger. And yeah, so I couldn't relate to the other kids who were like, oh, I'm so hungry in the morning, and they couldn't wait to get to their lunch breaks. And honestly, lunch breaks weren't the most pleasant experience for me, especially in primary and secondary school, because there were lots of people. It was kind of overwhelming, and I didn't feel that hungry, so a lot of the time I felt like I was forcing myself to eat, and I would rather have done something else, and sometimes I would skip lunch, which I don't necessarily recommend, but the third point is I was told that I was gifted, that I was wise for my age, that I was exceptionally good at school. And actually, when I saw my first therapist when I was 18, the first psychologist that I saw, I only talked to her for 4 sessions. I only did 4 sessions with her, and one of the first things she said was as I was telling her about my childhood and my school experience, she was like, I think you were pretty gifted as a child, and just you weren't diagnosed. And now I don't think I was gifted per se, but I think it was my autism definitely that wasn't diagnosed. But people would say that I was wise for my age. I would prefer talking to the adults rather than the kids my own age. I often preferred older people, because kids just seemed very immature to me. And whenever, in social events, social gatherings and stuff, whenever there was a table for the adults and a table for the children, and I was asked to go sit with the other children, I was kind of frustrated because I wanted to sit with the adults and take part in the discussions and listen and stuff, because the kids were a bit boring to me. And yeah, I was always pretty good at school without putting much effort into it, and I remember thinking that there was a real gap between me and the other children, because I could see that they were struggling a lot more than me. And I don't know, I guess I could tell that I was different in that sense. I was like, it seems to be much easier for me to do these things. Pretty intuitive, even things that were considered objectively difficult, like French grammar, which is notoriously difficult, in the sense that it was made difficult intentionally by those who didn't want the common people to learn the language. They wanted the common people to remain illiterate and stuff like that, and make the language inaccessible to most people and stuff like that anyway. So the French language was made not like intentionally difficult and nonsensical, and I didn't struggle. Like, you taught me a rule and I was like, okay, registered. I was like, I didn't struggle with it afterwards, and so school was very easy for me, and I didn't need to work very hard to get good grades. Something else is I had a strong sense of wonder and amazement and excitement at things that you might think like all kids are like that, but and I agree, but to me I could really tell that there was a difference because I seem to experience everything so much more strongly and intensely than the other kids. Like whenever I had friends coming over to play, whenever they would arrive, like I would be so excited, I would be choking out of excitement. Like I would lose my voice out of excitement. That was how intense it was. Whenever I watched movies, I felt like I experienced everything so much more intensely. Whenever, for example, we would go to the cinema at school, we would be taken to the cinema to watch a movie, or we would watch a movie in class. I remember being so moved by everything. I would cry very easily and stuff, and I would look around and all the other kids were bored, or they were talking to each other, they just didn't care, and I felt quite embarrassed because I seemed to be much more sensitive emotionally, and I was always told my whole life that I was too sensitive. They didn't mean that in the sense of like sensory sensitivities, they meant emotionally. I was emotionally very sensitive. And so I was just perpetually in wonder and amazed and excited at things, and I experienced things very, very intensely. Something else is I had stims already as a kid. I had a massive skin picking stim that I still have to this day, where I would pick the inside of my thumbs, which I still do. Like I'm doing this right now as I'm recording the video. That was one of my, where is my fidget? Because if I had a fidget, I wouldn't be picking my skin so much. Okay. So yeah, I would pick my skin a lot, and I would be stigmatized for it, especially by my dad, who would tell me like, if you don't stop doing that, your skin's not gonna grow back. Like he would try to scare me, which didn't work. It just made me feel worse about it, and like there was something wrong with it, and like kids in school would find it weird, so I would hide it most of the time. I would also suck on my middle and ring fingers. So I wasn't a thumb sucker as a kid. I sucked my middle and ring fingers, and especially whenever, like, my mom loved telling that memory of like putting on a movie, and then I would my eyes would be fixed on the screen, and I would very slowly open my mouth. Like I would make a whole ritual out of it, of like very slowly opening my mouth and like putting my fingers in my mouth. And like, yeah, I always thought it was a bit unusual that I was sucking on my middle and ring fingers. I know other kids do that, but growing up I was the only one that I knew of who did that, so I always thought that was a bit different. And I also loved swinging, running, jumping around. I had nervous tics, so I don't know if those count as stims or nervous tics, because from a pretty young age I was pretty stressed. I think both from the undiagnosed autism and the fact that I lived in a pretty dysfunctional, abusive family, and so I would have nervous tics where I would do things with my eyes, and I would be, again, like I would be pretty stigmatized for those. I have a pretty vivid memory of being on holiday with my half sister, and I was a bit stressed because I never felt very comfortable with her, and like I would like shift my eye focus and shift my gaze in and out of focus or something, and she was like so grossed out by it. She was like, stop doing that, that's so weird. And like, I don't know, it always made me feel, those kinds of reactions always made me feel like there was something so wrong with me. I also had OCD tendencies, which I've talked about in past videos, where if I turned in one direction, I had to turn in the other direction to cancel the first turn, or something bad would happen. Like I had compulsions like that. I would also repeat words in my head to help calm me down. So all these are more like OCD tendencies, but that just goes to show, I guess, the stress that I was under as a younger kid. Another autistic trait is that I was naturally very flexible. Why is it considered an autistic trait? To me, it's not directly linked to autism, but it's a common comorbidity, which is hypermobility and EDS. I don't think I have EDS, but I'm definitely hypermobile. Like I fit the criteria for hypermobility, and so I was naturally very flexible, and I would use it to my advantage. I found that it was, along with humor, when I was a kid, I found it was a good way to interact with people. And like I would literally like not say anything and like get into a split in the middle of everyone. I have a memory of something like that at a party. As a kid, I would just go into a split, and I was so flexible I didn't even need to stretch for it. I would just get straight into a split out of the blue, and everyone would be like, whoa, it's so impressive. And so that was like my social gratification. Is I didn't know how to talk to people, but I would do weird things with my body and use humor to try and fit in as best as possible. Something else is I had very sensitive skin from a very young age, even as a baby. And so for a long time I had to apply lotion, and it was mostly on my legs. So I would scratch my legs a lot. And so at first, doctors thought it was like some type of dermatitis, so I had to apply lotion. And then as I grew older, they thought it was related to stress. Something that I didn't find out until I was an adult. My parents didn't tell me. Now that I look back and I look at my life through the lens of autism, I think what it was is I was pretty sensitive to jeans, and that was the only thing we wore back then. Nowadays, the trend is more like into leggings and stuff, but back then, everyone wore jeans. And so I would wear jeans every day. And when I stopped wearing jeans every day, I noticed that my legs, I didn't scratch my legs as much. So I think I'm sensitive to jeans. I'm a bit sensitive to that texture. Okay, the next one is I was painfully shy around strangers. And when I say painfully shy, I mean borderline like selective mutism, where you could barely get a word out of me around strangers. And my parents would try and train me, and they would tell me like, go to this shop and ask for this, and I was absolutely unable to do it. I was unable to do anything without my parents. And even the people I knew, even people who weren't complete strangers but that I didn't see very often, like I always had to warm up to them whenever I saw them, break the ice again, you know? Same thing with like shows or performances at school. Like I have a vivid memory of I don't know, I must have been maybe 6 years old, and I was in a show at school. I was supposed to be a mouse. Like when it was time for me to be on stage and do my thing, like I was hidden behind a panel or something that represented a bush, I guess, or something, and I was supposed to come out of there and do my thing, and I didn't. I just stayed behind the panel and I didn't move. I was completely petrified. But I was completely obsessed with the mouse costume, which was like basically a headband with mouse ears, grey and pink, and then there was a tail with an elastic band that you would put around your belly. And like I remember that I would wear that costume, and it was a cheap costume. I think it was made of paper and a bit of fabric on top. Like it was cheap, but I loved it so much. I guess we were allowed to keep the costume. I remember I wore it like every day for weeks because, as I mentioned in videos in the past, I was obsessed with animals, and I would always pretend to be an animal, and so and I felt much closer to animals than humans, and so anything that could make me feel closer to an animal. I absolutely loved it. So I loved that costume so much. Something else was like my mother wanted me to participate to a casting audition for a movie that was doing auditions in my area. Again, I must have been 4. I was so scared. Like I didn't want to do it. I was so shy. And so I was very, very shy around people, but then whenever I was talking about my interests, I would completely come out of my shell, and it was like I was a completely different person, almost like I had 2 personalities, and people found that pretty funny. And my mom would always say like, oh, that's what it is when you're shy, you don't talk, and then when you warm up to people, you can't shut up. And I always had this definition of what it was like to be shy in my head, and now looking back, I'm like, I don't know, I'm not sure that's what shy people typically do. I think it was just me being animated by talking about my interests. I also had an unusual attention span focus in nursery school. My mom told me that my nursery preschool teachers would say that I was like unusually focused whenever they would put on a movie, because movies are one of my special interests. I was been fascinated by movies. So yeah, all the other kids would be playing together and I would be taped to the TV. And I didn't care what the other kids were doing. And like the other kids of that age would have an attention span of like around 15 minutes. And I could stare at a screen for an hour and a half. And the nursery teachers were pretty amazed by that. And then around that time, whenever I would come home, and all these things I don't have memories of. That's like these things that I'm talking about in nursery school, I have no recollection of that. This is all based on what my mum told me long before I suspected I might be autistic. She would say that every day after school, after nursery school, I would come home and ask to watch Disney's 100 Dalmatians every single day for months. Every single day. I would ask it in a pretty cute way. I didn't know how to say it properly, so like I had my own way of saying it. Instead of saying like the actual title of the movie, I would say toutes les tâches in French, which means like, it doesn't mean anything actually. It means doggy spots. Doggy spots? Doggy the spots. Like it makes no sense, but like because the Dalmatians had spots and they were dogs, I don't know. The next point is I had a lot of behavioral issues in school, and I'm not sure if that was more related to being autistic or to being from an abusive household where I was so accustomed to witnessing violence, either between my parents, like domestic violence, or being a victim of violence from my dad, that it kind of normalized it in my eyes, and then I would be violent towards other kids. But in any case, my teachers, so that was mainly in primary school, my teachers raised concerns to my parents and said I should be taken to a child psychiatrist, but my parents didn't do anything about it. I would also steal as a child. Like I would see something, like I remember one time I saw a scrunchie that I really liked in a shop and I just took it. But the best part is it's almost like either I didn't know that it was wrong or I wanted to get caught somehow, because I wouldn't hide it. Same thing with one time I stole a Tamagotchi in primary school from a friend who, because it was all the rage at the time and I wanted one so bad, but my parents didn't want to buy me one. And so I remember perfectly it was yellow and it was on a lanyard, but it was not an actual lanyard. It was like a lanyard that was like a zip, and I wanted it so bad and I just took it. Like lunch break when everyone was gone, I went to that kid's table in class and I took it from her bag, and the next day I wore it at school, and I don't know what went on in my head. Like, I knew I was gonna get caught, but maybe I wanted to. I think a lot of my behavioral issues as a kid, unconsciously, were me trying to ask for help, trying to get people's attention, because somehow I must have known subconsciously that I was not okay at home or just in general. There were a lot of things like that, and whenever my teachers would tell my parents that I should see a specialist, maybe, like, they never did anything about it. They would talk to me at home, or even one time they took me to a restaurant. I was like so confused because I expected them to be really hard on me, and they weren't, and I was just, I don't know, I was confused. The next point is I was constantly in my own world. I was constantly daydreaming about either about being an animal or being in one of my favorite fantasy worlds. And I'm talking like all the way into high school. Like, it was not just something I did as a little kid. Like, I was a chronic daydreamer to the point where I think it could fall into the realm of dissociation because somehow, like, I was still able to follow in class and stuff. And it's one of the reasons why I know that I don't have ADHD, is because I never had trouble regulating my attention, but I would always be I would be somewhere else in my head. In class, in physical PE class, yeah, I would always be pretending to be a horse in my head, or a dog, or a tiger, or even in the courtyard, like in primary school, in the courtyard of the school, at recess, I think it's called recess. Breaks, we had a break in the morning, a break in the afternoon, and then like an hour and a half for lunch in primary school. When I wasn't playing with the boys, I was just playing on my own. I was running around, pretending to be a tiger, jumping everywhere, and people must have thought I was so crazy, but I didn't mask as much at the time, which is probably why everyone said I was so weird. Something else I also did was I was constantly asking any guest or family friend who came to the house to scratch my back, or even at school. And people would play with your hair, scratch your back, write things on your arms. I loved that. Even though I didn't like hugs and kisses and stuff, but I loved it when people would scratch my back. And my parents would always say that I was being annoying, but the guests would be pretty amused by it. And there was this one family friend who actually loved cats, and so she loved just stroking cats, and I feel like to her I was almost like, it was the same to her scratching my back as it was scratching a cat, like, so she would do it all the time, and I loved it so much. Of course, as I got older it became a bit more awkward, like, it's fine when you're a kid. But the next point is the first time that we moved to a different house. I must have been 6 or 8 years old, and it was absolutely traumatic for me. And the reason why I remember it was traumatic is because it was the only time in my childhood where I struggled with, the only time in my life really that I struggled with sleepwalking. I was just completely confused because I was so used to my old bedroom that I remember for a long time I would often wake up in the middle of the night feeling completely lost, panicked, because I didn't know where I was. I was in the dark and I didn't know where my bedside lamp was. I would have this moment of panic of like not finding the light and like being lost in the dark. And I would sleepwalk a lot, where I would leave my bed and I would wake up on the floor. I would wet the bed, and sometimes I would leave my bed and like pee on the floor, like TMI, right? And I have this very vivid memory of like actually climbing on top of a piece of furniture I had, and I had a bunch of pens and stuff on it. And I remember I was dreaming at the same time, and I was dreaming that I was laying somewhere, and I was thinking in my dream like, wow, it's uncomfortable with all these rocks underneath me, but actually they weren't rocks, they were like pens and pencils and stuff. And I stayed on that piece of furniture the whole night, and I was woken up in the morning by, basically I fell from that piece of furniture and I fell on my head, and that's how I woke up. Can you imagine how traumatic that must have been? Like, I also have a memory of that place that we moved to, and we only lived there for a year, I think. And I was pretty lost, because I didn't even know what day it was and stuff. And I remember one day crying and telling my parents, like, I don't want to go to school today. And they were like, but it's Saturday. And I was so happy. Another trait was that I struggled with change more than I do now. I feel like it got better over time, but for example, I would freak out whenever one of the lights went out in my room, because it would change the whole atmosphere of the room. I didn't like that at all, and it felt like it wasn't my room anymore. I felt like I was in an unknown place, an unfamiliar place, you know. And it felt so uncomfortable, and I would like harass my dad so that he could change the light bulb, and then it wouldn't be the same lighting as before because it was a different light bulb or whatever. And I was just so, I hated it so much, those kinds of changes that really like upset me. Also, like, I was some things were very sacred to me and still are, like Christmas and like going to my grandparents in the summer. And so whenever one of these things would change or would be cancelled, or like, that was so devastating to me. Like, I remember there were years when my mom would be like, oh, I can't be bothered to put up a Christmas tree this year, and I would be so upset. Like, to me it was not, or like if there were talks of like doing Christmas at someone else's house, and I was like, no, Christmas is at my house. And still to this day I struggle with that. Like, I have to do Christmas in a very specific way. And yeah, I just couldn't stand it when any of these sacred things were changed, you know. And this is linked to monotropism and stuff, but I really struggled to change my mind once it was set on something. And sometimes that could lead to meltdowns, which were misconstrued as tantrums. But like, it was very upsetting to me. I also had very intense interests from a young age. So again, I made a whole video about special interests. But I was obsessed with movies. I had like a whole VHS DVD collection that was like my treasure. And every day after school, I would come home and like pick a movie from my collection and watch it. Like, that was my highlight of the day. I was obsessed with anything to do with fantasy, so fantasy movies, fantasy games, fantasy books. I would write my own fantasy stories. I was also obsessed with animals, and I had like hyperfixations on different kinds of animals, like snails and mice and frogs and cats and horses. And like I said, with Christmas, it was very important to me. So like every October, I'd start planning Christmas with my parents and my grandparents and my great aunt, and I took it so seriously, and it took so much of my time and thoughts. And like, I would print out a whole program, and I would have like, it was a whole thing. Like, I would have a speech. I remember one year I took it so seriously, I put so much pressure on myself for it, that I got physically sick from it, like from the anticipation, the excitement, and the pressure and stuff, that it made me actually sick on Christmas Eve, like vomiting and stuff from all that excitement. I also had a plushie collection, and everyone in my family and friends and stuff knew how much I loved plushies. And so I had a collection of plushies that was so big it filled an entire cot bed, like to the brim. Generally, I was very attached to my toys. I would take my plushies around with me everywhere and like dress them in clothes and give them names and put them in certain situations, and then take pictures of them and I would pretend that they were my children. Like, I would go pretty far with it. I was also a huge animal lover, as I said, and I preferred the company of animals to humans by far. And I think it's because I felt like animals understood me and I understood animals more than humans, you know. I found them easier to understand, and I liked that they didn't speak and they didn't judge. They loved you for who you were, you know, they didn't discriminate. And I often thought, like, I hear a lot of autistic people say they always felt like they weren't aliens. For me, I thought I had been born in the wrong species. I thought I was meant to be an animal, which is why I spent so much of my childhood pretending to be an animal. And so I always spent time with animals. I would always say, I would say to everyone in school, like, very proudly, that my dog was my best friend. And I always thought, like, when my dog is gonna die, I'm not gonna survive. And as a little kid, like as a toddler, my mom told me that at Christmas I would always want my dog to open his gift before opening mine. So I think that was pretty cute. As I said, like, once I got comfortable around people, I would start monologuing about my special interest, which is something that I don't do anymore because of masking. I would talk their ear off about my special interest, even if they weren't interested. But it wasn't so much that I didn't notice they weren't interested. It was more that I thought I just need to keep talking about it. That way they'll understand why it's so cool and they'll become a fan like me. Almost like I thought there's no way they can't like it. They just need to know more about it, you know? Like, I was trying to convince them of how cool it was. Like, I remember talking for hours about Harry Potter to my half-sister, for example, who didn't like, she's never been really into fiction or anything like that. She wasn't interested in it. She even looked at me with a bit of a smirk, mocking me almost. But I couldn't, like, I didn't care. I kept going on and on about it, and I thought, if I keep going long enough, I'm gonna convert her, like, I'm gonna convince her, and it's gonna be her new passion or something. I wasn't a very social kid, and I would often be told by teachers and stuff that I needed to mingle with the other kids more. I needed to try and fit in with the other kids because I was often doing my own thing. I remember not really knowing how and feeling a bit lost or just not being interested at all in the other kids. It was a mix of feelings. I definitely thought that the other kids were annoying most of the time and immature, that I had better things to do, but also I enjoyed having friends that I could play with. So it depended on the context, and yeah. But I remember being, like, on several occasions, being told to blend in with the other kids more, and I just either didn't know how or wasn't interested in it. I was also bullied in school and told that I was weird a lot, which I feel like is an experience we pretty much all autistic people share. And even, like, as an older kid in secondary school, I remember I was pretty confused about how to make friends, because I have this one pretty embarrassing memory of texting a popular girl at my school. I'm not even sure how I got her number, but it was back before smartphones were a thing, right? I texted her and I asked her to be my best friend, and we barely knew each other, and she was like, that's not how it works, you know? Like, we have to, like, you don't decide to become best friends with someone. You have to build that relationship over time and share experiences together and stuff. And I felt so dumb and sad and embarrassed. I was never part of more than a trio of friends. I was never part of a big group or anything like that. My friends would often find me quite bossy and annoying because I kept telling them what to do, and I kept talking about my interests, which they weren't necessarily interested in. In school, I was also often told that I didn't speak loud enough, and I was told to speak up in class a lot, and that was a big that stressed me out a lot. And especially that thing in class when you're like, they ask you to speak and you don't speak loud enough because you're shy, and then everyone turns around to look at you. Horrible. I also had sensory issues, so I made a whole video about sensory issues. The ones I had as a kid specifically was, in terms of food, I couldn't stand like stringy, fibrous vegetables and runny egg whites and the grease in meat. So as I explained many times before, I would spit it out into a napkin, and when my parents weren't looking, I would throw it away. Or I would always end up having a bunch of stuff on the edge of my plate that I didn't want to eat. Like, I was very like, I could spend hours picking grease out of meat or just any part of the dish, the food that I didn't want to eat, and like putting it on the side of my plate. And then afterwards my mom would be like, because my mom was obsessed with like food waste and stuff like that. She absolutely hated wasting food. And so at the end of a meal, she would be like, tell me what you chewed up and what you didn't chew up. And then she would eat the stuff that I hadn't chewed. I also couldn't stand fizzy drinks. I felt like I was swallowing needles and it made me cry. Perfume was way too strong for me, made me very nauseous. I didn't like wearing hats or watches or glasses. I just didn't like anything on my body, really. I didn't really have a sweet tooth, which is surprising for a kid. And I was obsessed with certain foods that were a bit strange. Like, I could eat pickles straight from the jar, or I would steal those cans of tuna in tomato sauce that my mom would buy, and I would steal bags of crisps and stuff, or appetizers, and take them to my room and eat them in secret. I was obsessed with that because basically I loved anything salty, savory, tangy, sour. Yeah, I was all for it. But I hated anything bitter. Like, I remember growing up and trying coffee because I was like, well, everyone likes coffee, so I guess I should start drinking coffee. And no matter how often I tried, I could never finish like a cup of coffee. It was, even if I put like this much coffee in and this much milk, it was still way too strong for me. Anything that had pasta or noodles in it was like a massive comfort food for me. Also, I mentioned in the past that I was given glasses as a kid, and later on I found out that actually there was nothing wrong with my eyesight, and what had been diagnosed as astigmatism was actually light sensitivity. I also spoke very well in a very articulated way, and I spoke very proper French, and I would often correct the other kids in how they spoke or how they wrote. I would always be like pointing out mistakes that they made, and it would drive them insane. They'd be like, we're not even at school right now, we're having fun and you're like annoying me with this. And I was like, you gotta do it right. Like, I was really like a perfectionist. The next point is not very joyful, but as I mentioned several times in past videos, I was abused at home, and I also witnessed domestic violence. And what I think is a bit of an autistic trait is that I never thought to tell anyone. It never even occurred to me. I was completely convinced that my life was perfect and my parents were perfect, and so I was very susceptible to their manipulation and their lies way until into adulthood. I even had a pretty unhealthy friendship, or several pretty unhealthy friendships, and I didn't realize it until much later in life. I also hated going shopping because I didn't understand fashion and trends and things like that, and I had absolutely no interest in that. And I thought, what a waste of time that I would rather have spent on my interests at home. So whenever my mom would be like, do you want to go shopping with me? I would be like, if I really couldn't avoid it, I wanted to make it as quick as possible. She would always ask me to go try on clothes in the shops, and I hated that. I would always say like, no, it's fine, and she would be like, well, we don't know if they fit, like you need to try them on to make sure. I was like, I don't care, like let's go. I just wanted to go home. Because I didn't have a strong sense of gender either, I wasn't into anything girly or anything that the other girls my age liked, and I would usually hang out with the boys more, and I was told that I was a bit of a tomboy because the boys matched my energy levels and my interest in play more than the girls, which were more into talking. Something else is that I was often told, especially by my mother, that I smiled wrong in pictures. And so at first I would smile without showing my teeth, and so she said it looked like I was constipated. I don't remember what she said, something very nice probably. And so after that I tried smiling with showing my teeth, and again, like it looked a bit strange, and like, yeah, she would always tell me that I smiled wrong in photos. And so I reached a point where I just, because I didn't know how to smile in photos, I would make funny faces, and then she would be like, don't make funny faces, be serious. So it was like whatever I did, it was always wrong. And like I would often be asked what was wrong, because I have a pretty flat affect naturally. I have a lack of facial expressions, or I don't necessarily have like the right facial expression for the situation, and it doesn't necessarily reflect what I'm feeling on the inside, and so people would often be confused and ask me, like even to this day, like ask me like what's wrong and stuff. I would also be criticized for my handwriting because it wasn't as legible and pretty as it should have been. And I don't know if it's dyspraxia or something like that, but I just always had a bad handwriting. Like I've often been told that I have a doctor's handwriting, you know, all that stuff. Also at school, I didn't do well in any type of sport that required coordination or a sense of direction or teamwork, but I was really good at solo sports that required speed and flexibility. And I was even bullied by my PE teachers, who said that I was dumb, because I remember one time I scored against my own team in football because I was so confused. And like most of the time I wouldn't be picked for teams. I would be the last one being picked for teams, and no one would throw me the ball. Like people were really confused and didn't know what to do with me. And I remember something very embarrassing that stuck with me over the years is I would be taking swimming classes, and for some reason the swimming instructor thought it was a good idea to give not grades, but like he would associate an animal with each student based on their skill levels and their, you know, ability to swim. And so I remember all of the other kids in my swim class were given dolphin. I was given octopus, which doesn't make sense to me, because are you implying that octopuses don't swim well? Like, I don't get it. But like I could feel the weight of just humiliation. Like he would really emphasize how bad I was at swimming, and I was the only octopus in the class. Everyone else was a dolphin, and that was really humiliating to me. I also struggled to express my feelings verbally, so I would often do it through writing. For example, I would write letters to my parents to express what I felt, and overall I always felt much more comfortable in writing than in speaking, even to this day. I was also a very slow reader, and I think it's because I struggled to picture what I'm reading. For the longest time I couldn't figure out why I was such a slow reader. And when I started looking into autism, and I started taking autism tests, and some of the questions were, I struggled to picture what characters look like and stuff like that, I was like, that's me. It took me a really long time to get through a book, and it caused me a lot of embarrassment because my mom was a French teacher. She has a passion for literature, and so she put a lot of pressure on me to be a good reader like her. but I couldn't keep up, and I always felt like a failure because of that. And in school it was difficult for me to keep up with all the books that we were being asked to read. Like I wouldn't finish on time, and I would have to read like online summaries and stuff, and I would feel so embarrassed as the daughter of a French teacher. You know, I felt like I was supposed to do better than that. Also, something else that I noticed later in my school years, but I found it so uncomfortable to look the teachers in the eye, and I would always find ways to avoid looking into their eyes. I don't know, it felt really uncomfortable. In class, I was always doodling or playing with my pens or playing with glue. Like, I don't know if it's something in every culture, but we would have like liquid glue, and we would put it all over our hands and then rub our hands together, and the glue would solidify, and we would turn it into a ball, and you would end up with a ball that big of like solid glue, which now looking back on it sounds a bit gross, but I don't know, we would do all sorts of things like that, and I was always doing that or doodling or playing with my pens. And like I would spend every class hoping that I wouldn't be asked to speak in front of the class, because that was the worst thing ever for me, and that the day would be over soon so I could go home and like watch my comfort movies. I also had meltdowns as a kid where I had big emotions, or I felt frustrated or misunderstood, or there was some type of injustice, and so I would scream at the top of my lungs to a point of like losing my voice. I would hit my head, pull my hair, kick and throw things across the room. I wouldn't even push people away. Sometimes I was physically, violent. I didn't control it, which, is the main difference between a tantrum and a meltdown. Is a tantrum is done intentionally, and it's a form of manipulation to try and get something, whereas a meltdown is very much like your emotions are too much to handle and it explodes, and like you have no control over anything. So I had meltdowns like that, and like the way my parents handled it was either ignoring it when I was having a meltdown in my room, or giving me cold showers to calm me down. Thanks, Dad. I also had a really good memory, and so I would entertain people by imitating movie characters and remembering movie soundtracks really well. Like to this day, like I'll be rewatching a movie that I haven't seen in a long time, and like I'm singing the soundtrack at the same time. My partner is like, how do you remember that? I don't know, I always had it. There are things I have an awful memory for, like I don't remember people's names much. I don't remember the names of places, song lyrics. I'm terrible at all that, but I'm really good at remembering. Like I have a good auditory memory. Character voices, movie soundtracks. I'd always be imitating characters from movies, and my mom found it really entertaining, and so she'd ask me to do it in front of guests and stuff. That was also another way I connected with people that didn't involve an actual conversation. From a young age, I had anxiety and stress, and I remember even when I was in secondary school, I went to my GP because I thought I had asthma, and it turns out I just had chronic hyperventilation from stress. And I would always try to miss school as much as possible, and like sick days and snow days and like days where there was a teacher missing or just school was off for some reason, those were the best days ever. Not having to go to school, that was such a blessing. And I remember one time that I didn't want to get out of bed in the morning, and I kept crying and stuff, and my mom said that I could stay at home. Overall, I felt very different as a kid. I identified with a lot of characters in stories and stuff for that reason. Like, for example, Harry Potter. Always knew he was different when he was in the Muggle world, and then he found the Wizarding world where he belonged, and I was kind of always fantasizing about not being in the right world. Like I was always fantasizing about a dragon coming to take me away to his world, and like somehow like I felt like I always knew that I didn't belong, you know, in this world, and like I had very poor self-image, but I would try and make up for it, I guess, in some way by thinking that I was special like Harry Potter, and that I don't know, that I must have some kind of superpower. Like I was trying to make myself feel better about myself by thinking, yeah, you're different, you're definitely different, but in a good way. And like I was trying to convince myself and stuff, but at the end of the day I had terrible self-esteem and self-image. Yeah, and I felt so different from everybody else. So that's it. Those are all the childhood autistic traits of mine that I could think of. That's quite a few. Again, if I remember anything else, maybe I'll make a part 2, but in the meantime, that's it. Comment down below what your main childhood autistic traits were. Thanks for liking, commenting, subscribing, and what's the 4th one? Thanks for watching, liking, commenting, and subscribing. I have a Ko-fi page linked down below in case you'd like to donate to support my channel monetarily, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye!